Okay, so we're ready to start our next session. I think we finished off our last panel quite nicely. Antonio did a good job leading us into a little bit of talking about industry perspectives and the importance of fleets with respect to cell phones. So our next panel is actually going to look at that issue in a little more detail, and we're very pleased to have two distinguished speakers to talk about industry experiences with distracted driving. I know certainly in the research community, in the transportation and the health community, we've spent a lot of time thinking about distracted driving, and it's important to recognize that outside of our fields, other people are thinking about it as well. So we're going to hear from industry. Our first speaker is Paul Greco. Paul is the Director of Corporate Environmental Health and Safety Canada for Spectra Energy. He has been with them since 1988, and he leads the development of corporate environmental health and safety strategies, policies, and programs to achieve Spectra Energy's vision of a zero-incident culture. So he's going to start off talking about Canada. Perfect.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity, CA and TIRF for inviting me, and of course Jack for connecting me to give me the opportunity. Many opportunities I get like this in my life, so Jack owes me one. But I am very happy to be here. It's been a very interesting conference. One thing I'm very happy to hear was my friend from Ontario who made the comment about accidents. There is no accident in this world. It's an incident. It happens. It's unwanted. It's something that we don't want to happen, and we have erased the word accident from our vocabulary as well. Unfortunately, not everybody has moved along the cultural path. So one of the things I'm going to talk today a lot about is about culture. I know that there were a few questions earlier about behaviors, and really that's what I'm here to talk about today. Now, hopefully I accomplished my objective. One thing you'll know about me is I am not a researcher. I am an engineer, but I am not a researcher. I'm the furthest thing from a researcher. If any of you do Myers-Briggs, I'm an ENTJ. And if you know anything about that, you'll know I'm really not grounded in facts and principles. I'm grounded in intuition. So a lot of what I talk about is based on my feel and what I think is right. The good news is I'm in a different type of personality thing. I'm called a core. So I flip around quite a bit so I can change my mind on issues and move around very easily. Now, what you've all done right now is you've all just made an assessment of me and who I am as a human being. And it's all based on your values and your beliefs and the things that you've learned through your years. Now, I might change those values, I might change those opinions of you over time, but you've made something. And that's based on your hardwiring. And our hardwiring is the greatest thing we have in our heads. We have a very small conscious mind, but a very large hard drive. The fact that I can stand up here and walk, and I might fall down, so I do walk around, and I'm kind of over the top a little bit sometimes, but I can walk and I can talk, so I can actually do two things at the same time, but I cannot do two cognizant things at the same time that require my brain power. So I agree with the concept that you can't do very complex tasks. Now, some might argue what is a complex task and what isn't a complex task. And I'm not really going to debate that. I know for men, complex tasks are sometimes talking, so we really can't multitask very well, which is why I'll stumble and trip and fall as I try and do my presentation. Anyways, I'm going to get off me now, and I'm going to move on to something much more important. So I'll talk about who we are, our leadership commitment, because that's very important to this concept. I'll talk about our safe driving culture and a little bit about programs and procedures. So the first thing, of course, the best company that ever existed in the planet is Spectra Energy, which I am part of. I started when I was 10, in case anybody was doing the math, because I started in '88, so you all know my age now. We have about 19,000 miles of transmission pipelines in Canada and the U.S. We have about 20,000 miles, or about 30,000 miles of distribution facilities as well in Ontario. 305 billion cubic feet of natural gas in storage to make sure that there's lots of gas in the winter when it gets cold. We didn't have a winter this year, but when we have winters, we make sure we get lots of gas into the Toronto area and the rest of Ontario. In Western Canada, we have an operation as well, and we have a midstream operation in the U.S. Approximately 5,400 employees. This is our footprint. It's a very large footprint across Canada. We have facilities that began, the U.S. operations begin in Houston and bring gas into the Northeast, distribution in Ontario, and processing in Western Canada. The industry is going through quite a revolution, but what you're going to see is it's a good revolution, bringing clean fuel to fuel the economy of both Canada and the United States. So one of the things, another topic I'm going to talk about is strategy. So strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. That's one of my favorite. I stole it. I didn't make it. Somebody in 490 BC thought it up, and it's still true today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in terms of how it's very important that you have a strategy. And I'd like to hear the OPP officer talk about their 4 points, which is really a strategy, which is good to hear. Now that I know the strategy, too, I know how to combat it. Not that I would ever do anything wrong. But so I've got a picture of a bowl of soup. And you'd probably wonder, it's a lot different than the rest of the presentations with graphs and charts and all sorts of stats. But when you think about safety culture, it really is a blend of things. And when this is, somebody taught me this a number of years ago, but the broth is our culture. Right? It's sort of that piece that surrounds everything. People always ask what's culture, and you can read the dictionary, and there's really complex definitions of some of the values and beliefs and norms and blah, blah, blah. It's very complicated. To me, it's the way you do things around here. Right? This room has a culture, right? And it's all based on us as human beings, each one of us being, of course, different. But it is based on a culture. And you need to have a strong culture surrounding something else, which is the meat and potatoes, which I call the policies and procedures. If you have bad policies and procedures, your stew is going to be terrible, and you're going to have a terrible, terrible organization. If you have terrible culture, you can write the best policies and procedures, and you will fail miserably. The two of them have to come together. And the other piece of all of this in terms of culture, which is very important, is culture will just destroy your strategy. Again, which is really a policies and procedures in that meat and potatoes. So if you really don't get all that stuff right coming together, it again, like I said, will fail. So how do you do all of this? Like how do you create that culture and create all those policies and procedures and everything that works well? And I don't have the answer for that. But we're trying. We continue to work at that to figure out how we're going to do it. But one of the things that really drives into me is about leadership. Okay, so at Spectra Energy, we've outlawed electronic devices in a vehicle when you're driving on company time, and of course we've told employees they can't use their company electronics when they're on personal time. Now that was an interesting process when we first did that, because I will tell you I'm a reformed non-smoker cell phone user. I used to be a construction guy, and I had wrote $1,500 a month on my cell phone. I threw it on the side of my head when I got in my truck in the morning, and I pulled it out of my ear when I got back to my house. Fortunately, nothing happened to me during those 10 glorious years. But it's hard to change people because that was my behavior. It was hardwired. That's the way I did business. Got up in the morning, threw my phone into my ear, and drove down the highway. The only way that change happens, we did all the research. You guys do a great job in giving us lots of data, so guys like me don't have to actually do the research and get the information. So it's really good. So you present the facts, and that's great. You can present all the facts in the world, but I still got my head hardwired that it's okay. I'm okay. I'm a better driver than anybody else. That things are going to be fine. So how do you switch those behaviors? And we did it. We banned it. My behavior changed because they made me the director of VHS, and it was my policy, so I really had to use it, or else I wasn't really walking the talk. But the reality is, we weren't going that path. Our path was going a little bit differently. We were going to actually just ban, hanging on to the phone. And our CEO, who was the president of Union Gas at the time, who's now the president of all of Spectra. He's from Ontario, too. Very wise man. But anyways, he said, no, that's not far enough. We're full banning. So Union Gas had 2,200 people, 2,200 votes. He had 2,201 votes. So he made the decision, and that was it. That ended the controversy. That ended the conversation. His point was, this is too serious of an issue. Okay? We can't rely on people kind of wanting to do this and kind of not wanting to do it. It's too serious. We all do risk assessments, right? I'm walking up here and I could fall down. There's no such thing as zero risk in this world. Risk is probability times consequence. We're really good at figuring out the consequences. We're horrific at figuring out the probability. So human beings just accept risk as time goes on. I mean, there's police officers walking around with guns. Think about that. People are throwing lead at them. They have to wear vests and protect themselves. That, to me, is unacceptable risk, but to them it's not. So everybody has their own ability to do a risk assessment. And the point was very valid before about the cost-benefit relationship human beings do as they're doing something. I have never had an issue. I will not have a problem. And the probability just disappears. You can show them all the pictures in the world of people dying. If they don't believe it's going to happen to them, then it doesn't matter what you do. You have to win the hearts and souls of people in order for them to change their behaviors. And there was a comment before, it was great, about don't blame people. Oh, for God's sakes, you can't. They're hardwired. We're hardwired. We have these beliefs that we have to unlearn. And if you start pointing your finger and telling people they're wrong, they turn you off. If I sat here and said, you're wrong in your belief that, that God exists, it just doesn't fit because it doesn't make sense to you. You can do all sorts of things to change those behaviors, but you certainly just can't come in and tell people. Adults don't learn by telling. Children are building up their database. We can all argue when it's full, but they're building up their hard drive. So our job is to sort of work with them when they're young, but once they hit a certain age, you're done. It's there. To unprogram, that's the challenge. A number of years ago, I was driving on the highway with my daughter on the 401, and my phone rang. And we had a cell phone ban, and of course my adrenaline level went up. Why is my phone going off? I got to answer it, which in itself is a distraction. So why did I have it turned on and why didn't I turn it off is a really good question. But the fact, my daughter kept on saying, Daddy, answer the phone. I'm saying, no, Joy, I don't answer the phone when I'm driving. But Daddy, someone's calling you. And I said, I don't answer the phone when I'm driving. So I'm hoping that I hardwired that in her brain, right? The sad part about it was the director of operations at the time, and the person who's calling me was to tell me about a person they caught driving on their cell phone. And he wanted to talk about how we should discipline them. So you talk about an ironic situation if I would have answered that phone. But it's hard. It's hard. I tell you, I struggle with it. I live in Chatham, by the way, the booming metropolis of Chatham, just halfway between London and Windsor, in case you're curious where it is. And you drive down the highway, and it's boring. And I'll tell you, I want to pick up that phone because I'm 3 hours to Toronto. I took a train now. I take trains a lot. I get people to drive me around because I can't work when I'm driving, right? That was a real big thing for me, was I realized I couldn't work when I was driving. Imagine that concept. I can't work when I'm driving. So it's very, very difficult for people. So how do you unwind those things? How do you change those behaviors, and how do you get in the hearts and minds of people? So I always talk to people, when you're being operated on, the doctor's got your stomach open, do you want him to be working on his crossword puzzle? If a guy's flying a plane and doing his checklists, what do you want him to be doing at that moment in time? When a gas technician goes in your house because you smell gas, what do you want them to be doing? I hope you want them to be paying attention to looking for that gas leak. Driving is no different. Drive. That's what you're in the car to do, is to drive. And how do you get that into people's heads? It isn't by telling them, right? Part of it is enforcement and rules and discipline and all that kind of stuff. But it isn't just telling them what to do because it's the right thing. We understand all that, but the place where those folks are is in a different place than where we are. It's hard to do it at companies, and we do it, and it usually takes 5 to 10 years before you change a behavior of a human being, right? To truly change that behavior. I drive on the roads now, and all I'm doing is looking around for people driving on their cell phones or using their cell phones when they're driving because they're just nasty people. I was one of them 10 years ago. And I thought I was the safest guy on the road. I used to be a cab driver too, so that tells you a little bit about my driving behaviors. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we did, and this is where I get into my strategy piece, is that we enacted a whole bunch of policies. Our frequency rate, collisions per million miles, used to be 7 or 8. We've dropped it down to 4. It's been 4 since 2006. You talk about research, about, geez, we plugged in this policy and let's show the trends and see if it went. No movement. Our numbers are the same, right? We've got a frequency of about 4, something like that. We're desperately trying to figure out a way to drop that frequency because people are going to get hurt. 2 years ago, we had a person die. A year ago, we had a vehicle flip over and 2 technicians got out of that vehicle. Thank God we're getting better at designing vehicles because when you have collisions, there's a less probability of someone getting hurt. This is all about people getting hurt. The concept of going to work and getting hurt, how fair is that? Like, it's offensive, right? Bottom line for sure, there's dollar amounts to it, but it's offensive for a person to go to work and get hurt. It's a horrible thing. So we're trying to figure out what we're going to do. So this is where we got all jigged up with the Nets guys and said, I need some help, because we're not finding a way to solve this. And Jack gave us some folks who have really been pushing things in a different way. Very sophisticated, large organizations that look and think about things differently than we did. I'll tell you, I went into a couple of those meetings and I walked out. You ever walk into a place you feel, oh, geez, I don't belong here. You know, I'm not adequate. And that's what it felt like. You see such great practices out there. And another peeve I have is there's no such thing as a best practice. There are effective practices in your organization based on the way you're built and you live. There's no such thing as the best. And if you find the best, let me know. But actually, don't let me know. You're a millionaire if you figure out. You're a billionaire if you figure it out. But you need to find effective practices that will work in your organization. It's almost like I always said about the safety gig. It's kind of an interesting occupation because there's no right answer. There's a whole bunch of good answers, right? Some of them work and some of them don't work. You just got to make sure everything is aligned together, and that's where you need a strategic approach. So what we've done now, based on the work that we did last year with our benchmarking exercise, was we recognized that we needed a more strategic approach to how we're going to manage the driver. This is no different driving the vehicle than it is working on a pipeline or in a processing plant. It's scary to be distracted when you're driving. It's even scarier if a human being is working on a big chemical plant, and they're distracted, and they turn the wrong valve, right? Or they miss the leak, or something like that happens. I mean, that's even scarier. So these behavioral concepts aren't any different for driving. It's a task. The problem that we've found is our injury frequency rate, it's gone from 5 or 6 down to, we're approaching 1 as an organization, and lower than 1 is really where you start getting into world class. We're approaching that. And we've made significant changes. And there's been significant interventions and significant concept changes in the organization, from leadership through policies and procedures all the way down the system. I'm part of AGA, American Gas Association. I was at this committee. There were 60 of us in the room. And they asked us, how many companies don't allow their people to jump in a hole with blowing gas? Right? So you've got a pipeline ruptures for whatever reason. 99% of the time somebody hits it. I was the only one that put up my hand out of the 60 companies, because other companies don't do that. But think about it. You're putting a person in a hole with gas blowing around them. It catches on fire. You know, I mean, but we used to do that because we thought it was the right thing to do because you didn't want to turn off customers. You know what? Customers can deal with being off for an hour or two, right? The safety of those human beings in that hole. You want to talk about a change in behavior for people? It's taken 8 years before people have truly believed in that principle and that philosophy. So what we decided to do the same. So we've had great success on the injury side, but for some reason on the vehicle side we haven't. We don't truly believe that people believe driving is a critical aspect of their role. They start driving when they're 16 years old and they can drive, and it's just something you do. It isn't something you do. It is an extremely critical task that you do in your job. You need to do that task the same way that you weld, that you cut into a live pipeline, that you operate a processing plant. The way that you do any one of those significantly dangerous things out there, but it's really hard to get people to feel that and understand it. You know, I went on a tour of a processing plant in the U.S. in northern British Columbia, and there's a lot of H2S. If you know anything about H2S, if you smell it, you're dead. As soon as you smelt it, you're dead, right? Because it's odorless, but as soon as you get a breath of it, it just kills you. And the VP of operations looked at me and he said, if I fall down, you run. And I just looked at him. He said, that's the kind of environment these people work in. So how do you make them feel that driving is an issue when they've been driving since 16 years old and they've never been hurt? And that's our challenge. So our challenge is to define that strategy with policies and procedures that make sense and programs that make sense with strong leadership, pushing that envelope. And I guess for all the policymakers in this room, I ask you to be leaders on that. To not sit back and create stuff that's kind of vague and hiding behind the veil of we can't enforce it. We have a policy on not driving with electronic devices. How do we enforce it? We don't have police officers running around seeing people and checking them. Didn't stop us from doing it, though, because it's too important. So I challenge you to take leadership as policymakers and make those strong leadership commitments, right? I understand that the world is a very dynamic thing and it's hard to get everybody, but you can do leadership inside of your own organizations. And Spectre's doing leadership inside of our own organization by not allowing people to use any type of electronic device when they're driving. Driving is a critical task, and that's where we're hoping to change our culture. So I'm going to turn it over to Jack.
So our next speaker, thank you very much, Paul. Our next speaker is Jack Hanley. Jack Hanley is the Executive Director of the Networks of Employers for Traffic Safety. We've had the pleasure to work with them in the past, and they've really garnered a lot of attention for their efforts with regards to benchmarking for fleet safety. So I'm going to let Jack tell you about what they've been doing.
Everybody's still wide awake. That was terrific what Paul talked about. I spent 30 years in a corporate environment. It's in my bio, and I can remember when I was an entry-level field sales rep in 1977, and I was given the keys to a vehicle, a Buick Century, red. And my boss, the sales manager, said to me, make your numbers, make them ethically, come home safe every night. And that was it. No policies, no driver training, no reminders. That was 1977 as a sales rep for Monsanto Company. And what we're looking at here suggests that things have changed an awful lot. I'm going to talk about, When Robin asked me to speak to the subject that she thought I was going to speak to, and first thank you very much to you and to the CAA for inviting me, I thought about this, and as I started looking at some of the presentations that were posted, I thought more and more about how can I talk about international distracted driving. If you think about international distracted driving for a minute, let's just break the world up into two large groups. One is the part of the world that represents the wealthier nations. And then we have everybody else. Now, I know that it's not apples to apples, but trust me, the U.S. and Canada and Western Europe are more alike than the U.S. and Canada and the Western Europe are to, say, South Africa. So what I decided to do was take a slightly different approach and take you on a slightly different journey in terms of what I'm going to say. I'm going to talk about what low-income and emerging nations have to deal with in terms of road safety. I'll weave in a little bit about distracted driving and how some of our benchmark members at NETS deal with it. So some of you may have seen this, and it has to be true because I got it on the internet through a Google search. Now, look very carefully at it. Who sees the anachronism? Take a look at that. Who sees it? Anybody? Charles, I think it was Goodyear, discovered vulcanization in about 1839. This is, 1769. Nonetheless, this is the first self-propelled vehicle. There's a reason for this. This one's a little more believable. It is the same vehicle that has been involved in a crash. So what we are talking about goes back to about 1769. And in fact, the very first self-propelled vehicle appears to have been the very first one involved in a crash. So our subject matter is old and is still not stale. Something about the organization I represent. I have the delight and pleasure of working for 11 terrific bosses, 2 federal U.S. agencies. You can look at the logos, and you can see very recognizable companies, many quite multinational. The products we have and the services are listed below. I should also mention that from time to time we do project work on behalf of NHTSA, and Amy Schick talked today about NHTSA and some of the work they're doing, and also for NIOSH. One of the things that sets the network of employers apart, I think, from an awful lot of other NGOs in the road safety arena, is that we are employer-focused. That is to say, most of our programs and services are directed at employers who then can direct them to employees. I'm not going to pretend to know anything about any place else other than the U.S. In the U.S., the population is about 300 million. Despite 8.2% unemployment, there are still 150-some million Americans employed. If you want to get to the population of a nation, I can't think of a better way to do it than through its employers, because they have families, the employees have families, and they live in communities. One of the things we're quite proud of is our annual benchmark program, and I'll say a word or two about that. There we go. Okay, that's where we were. This is a snapshot of what we captured last year. I am not going to belabor the numbers and bore you with all of the results. What I want you to understand is that one of the things we do is survey our members each year. They give us data, miles, crashes, by type of vehicle, by world area, injuries, fatalities. And they also respond to 25 questions, plus or minus, that speak to what they have in place to further road safety in their companies. Cell phone policies, post-crash review process reviews. By the way, as an aside, and probably germane though, fully 70% of our members ban all cell phone use. I'm not going to say that they ban it 100% in all business units and in all world areas, but I am going to say that 70% ban it in at least one world area and or business unit, and almost all are moving in that direction. You've heard a little bit about the business case. I could talk for an hour on the business case. I'm not going to do it. If you are engaged in managing a fleet, this is an old U.S. DOT number for a non-injury crash, bent metal only, count on about $15,000 to $16,000 out of pocket. In today's dollars, that's probably closer to 20 to 25. So it can be very significant. Remember, non-injury, no fatality, and no litigation. So here's a chart that I put in here just to give a flavor as to what numbers are reported around the world during our benchmark program. These are alphabetical. I don't know if you can read them from here. You don't necessarily have to. But there are some interesting takeaways here. Number one, Japan has the highest fatality, I take it back, has the highest crash per million mile rate among all of the countries reported in our benchmark survey. If you follow international statistics, Japan also has the lowest fatality rate. And I cannot explain this for you. But some of you may have caught it, but that's an interesting thing that I spotted. You don't want to drive in Turkey, and you don't want to drive in Egypt. Believe it or not, India reports 3.01 if you can read it. Think of an average global for our benchmark respondents of about 8.08. How can India be 3.01? I could debate this and discuss this for a long time, but I think there are cultural issues here. An awful lot of what might happen is that the engineer or sales rep will not report the collision and in fact may have it taken care of privately. But this is only a best guess on my part. But this is the kind of data that we get that's used by our benchmark members. At this point, I'm going to take a stop Some of you may be wondering what this is. Most of you could care less. Hopefully, I will pique some interest in it. I've seen a few. This is a pin for the Decade of Action for Road Safety. Do me a favor, raise your hand if you're familiar with the term. Well, that's terrific. One of the wonderful benefits of the job I have is that I have the honor of representing the Network of Employers for Traffic Safety as a member of the United Nations Road Safety Collaboration, which is, in fact, well, I'll call it the principal steering committee for the Decade of Action. I want to thank FIA here. It's been mentioned a few times already because some of the slides you're going to see next come from work they've done and presentations they've made. So this is the pin I'm wearing. That's the United Nations, and that's also the World Health. The umbrella organization is the United Nations. The specific organization responsible for the Decade of Action is the World Health Organization. So take a look at this. This is an interesting one to me. Total number of vehicles. I believe it's registered vehicles, but who's to say in some parts of the world. In 2008, plus or minus 672 million. Look at the shares held by rapidly emerging, mature, and lower growth economies. And look what's going to happen in 2018. It's a dramatic shift. Now, if you couple that shift with population trends, perhaps even deteriorating infrastructure, you can imagine what kind of injury, fatality, and death rates, there will be outside of, let's say, the developed world. I would expect a few of you are familiar with these little factoids. I don't think any of these are Photoshop, by the way. I think they're for real. The one on the lower right, if you count, that's 9 human beings. The 9th being the infant, being carted in a bucket on a motorbike. Now, that was sent to me. Has anybody seen this anywhere on the internet? Because it was sent to me by the road safety director for Abbott. Some of you may know Abbott Pharmaceutical. And he said he swears this is true. Well, at any rate, it makes the point. In the world today, over 100,000 per year die on the world's roadways. 100,000 per month, 1.3 million per year. The number of injuries ranges from 20 million per year to 50 million per year. We really don't know. Half of the injuries and fatalities are to the so-called vulnerable population. Those are pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorcyclists. And I've read this, and I'm not going to, I can't defend it, but I think maybe by exaggeration it makes a good point. In some countries, up to 4% of the gross national product is spent on dealing with traffic road-related injuries. It's estimated that in the year 2000, that's a while ago, the total cost of injuries in the world was $518 billion. Well, that's a long time ago. So if we do inflation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I would bet some amount of money that we may be close to $1 trillion today. I can't promise it, but that probably wouldn't be a bad guess. And this astounds me. There are, I believe, over 200 million countries in the world. There are only 15 countries that have comprehensive laws covering seatbelt use, child restraints, speeding, drink and drive, and wearing helmets. Much of the world, then, is a chaotic situation when you get behind the wheel. Red is really not good in this chart. To give you an idea of how the world is distributed in terms of risk when you get behind that wheel. And these are deaths per 100,000 population. That's That's a WHO way of looking at things. And Africa, lots of Asia, very dangerous parts of Latin America. So I've made the case that it's dangerous out there, much more dangerous outside the developed world than inside the developed world. And the Decade of Action for Road Safety has a principal goal, and that is, over the next 10 years or so, to make every effort possible to reduce the death and injury rate by close to 50%. And that gap, that green, represents the difference between a successful decade of action and doing nothing. So here are 5 things all of us take for granted when we get behind the wheel in Canada and the USA and in Western Europe. We take for granted that the roads are going to be reasonably safe. We take for granted that there are police officers out there watching after our best interest. We take for granted that the vehicle we're driving is going to perform the way it's supposed to, that the airbag will deploy. Good luck getting an airbag outside the developed world, by the way. We take for granted that families on motorbikes, if that exists in the developed world, will be at least wearing helmets, and motorcyclists. And very significantly, we take for granted that if we are in a crash and need medical attention, someone will show up. So many of the deaths that we have around the world are because they simply cannot get the medical attention to them. So given this backdrop of rather depressing statistics, what I thought about doing was giving you 3 little case studies. During the NETS conference last year, we had a handful of companies present on the road safety challenges they have in different parts of the world. So this is from Monsanto Company. It says Africa, but it really speaks, as you see here, to South Africa. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but there are cultural issues involved in a lot of this. And in South Africa, and once again, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I am told that there is a Good Samaritan streak in the folks. They will stop and help. And that is used to the advantage of people who are not such good Samaritans. There is another area here, as we get into the countermeasures, that what they decided to do was put in place serious policies, enforce the policies, they got serious about training, and they also increased the safety of the vehicles. I'm not saying anything here that's magical at all, but it was applying some attention to the problem they had. This is a company that chose not to be identified, but it's a huge $60+ billion. Issues they have in Asia. Many languages, sometimes many languages in the same country. And 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles, something we don't think about here. But they have a lot of business conducted using 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles. And they put together a program that really spoke to local ownership, measuring, better management of metrics, and serious goals and serious accountability for achieving those goals. This is Eli Lilly in Mexico. You know what? It's pretty much the same story. They did something very, very different, though. They actually resourced it by putting a full-time person on road safety in Mexico. Imagine the dangers of driving in Mexico City, coupled with the security dangers associated with Mexico these days. Well, they put something in place, more training behind the wheel, better policies, identify high-risk drivers, a number of things they did. I won't go into the details, but once again, part of it had to do with positive energy to move vehicle safety forward in their countries. I'm going to close with the best practices we found last year in the road safety benchmark we did. These are best practices that take into account every vehicle, every mile, every country. It's 100% of the data. They are best practices that are associated with those companies that have the lowest crash per million mile metrics. Once again, there's no need to read it, but the kind of the closer here is that they all capture metrics. They all take distracted driving seriously. A number of companies will terminate if you are using your cell phone while on company business and there is no appeal process. And they also reinforce behind-the-wheel training with any number of different things, whether it's computer-based, classroom, or can actually be flashes that come out through the cell phones. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. I know we're running a little bit behind time, but if there's any questions, we have time for maybe one question. Okay, well, thank you very much to Paul and to Jack for coming and sharing their insights with us. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Neil Schuster. Neil is the President and CEO of the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, which is a association of U.S. licensing agencies as well as law enforcement. They're somewhat equivalent to our Canadian Council on Motor Transport Administrators. So thank you to our speakers, and I'll turn it over to Neil.
Robin, thank you, and thank you both to TURF and CAA for putting this on, and I appreciate the opportunity to spend the day with you and learn so much about this issue. I guess I've learned more than anything else that driving is easy, but driving well and driving safely is kind of hard. And I've had some personal experience recently with a form of distraction that we haven't talked about today. We've talked a lot about devices in cars. I'm driving a Nissan Leaf as of a few months ago. I've got a dashboard that has 5 different ways to tell me my battery charge, which is very important when you can only go 80 or 100 miles on a charge. And there are some potentially huge distractions associated with that. And I've had to teach myself to learn what to look at and what not to look at so that I can focus on the road. Certainly with the advent of more and more electric vehicles, I think we'll see more of that issue coming out as well. This session takes a little bit of a look outward into the public interest and public reactions. And we've got 4 speakers. The bios are in your packet, so I'm not going to read them. We have 4 great speakers. We have a communications expert, a grassroots road safety advocate, an educator and actor, and an automotive journalist. Our first speaker is Dee Alsop, and from what I understand, he can't be here today, but he is joining us by Skype to give his presentation. I understand he's not doing it while he's in the car, which is a good thing. He's dialing in. He won't be able to hear us, but we'll be able to hear his presentation. Dee is with Heart and Mind Strategies, and he's our first speaker this afternoon.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you. I apologize. I wish I could be there in person. I know that there's a lot that comes from being there and hearing the other people and the issues that they're talking about and bringing to our attention and sharing that. And also want to thank Jamie and Andrew, who are making it possible for me to connect virtually with you today. It's my sincere hope that something that I share with you might be useful to each of you in the different ways that you're looking at and working on this issue. What we're going to be doing is sharing with you is a look at the texting and teenage distracted driving through the same eyes that we look at when we are doing some of the most successful and iconic campaigns in the United States. And go on to that next slide number 2 there, Jamie. The approach that we're used is one that we've used very successfully in like the What Happens Here Stays Here campaign for Las Vegas, the Milk Your Diet campaign for the Dairy Council, and a variety of other industry and issue campaigns for, in the United States. And And this work that I'm also sharing with you is sponsored by the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. They were the ones who started this and asked us to look into it. And the research that I'm going to be sharing with you is based on some in-depth qualitative research, as well as a large national sample that's projectable to youth who are between the ages of 17 and 26 who have a driver's license and either a cell phone or some other type of handheld device. If you go to the next slide, it should be on slide number 3, please. So these national campaigns I was talking about are based on what we call values research or values campaigns. And I want to tell you a little bit about what values are. Values are these central guideposts around which we organize our lives. When we're young, we develop our values, and they then guide us in the things that we consider are relevant to us and the things that we use to shape our decisions and our actions and our behaviors. And as a communicator, values are important to us because they are the basis around which we motivate people to actually take action, not just to have an attitude, but to take an action or to change their behavior. And values are also important because they're widely shared. And if I want to build a successful communications campaign, I look for those things around which are most commonly shared by the largest group of my target audience. And then the third reason why we like values is that values are stable. They don't change. So if I can understand the values and the decision-making around them and get that right, then the communications that I develop around them are fairly stable and enduring over time. In essence, we believe that there exists this strategic hinge that links the aspects of, or the attributes and the outward manifestations of distracted driving and identifies their consequences, which then tie into more physical or emotional consequences, which tie into our values. And so before I get too far, I want to tell you a little bit about what we learned when we looked at this group of people in the values perspective of distracted driving. First of all, we found out that youth are very interested and informed about distracted driving. Secondly, we found that they share these heroic assumptions about how safe of a driver and how good a driver they are. And thirdly, we also learned that they know that this is risky behavior. They know that this is the leading cause of death amongst their age group, and that they're having fairly frequent or high incidents of close calls, either themselves, with their friends, or with their family members. And if you'd go on to the next slide, this should be slide number 4 now. And basically, the point that comes out of this is that they know. And because young people know, and they know better, that they're most susceptible and responsive to messaging that directly confronts them with the tragic consequences of not acting on what they know. And that when we're able, through our messaging or our images, able to evoke these emotions or guilt, or as they put it, stupidity, that they would feel that if they were to cause an action, that that's the most effective way to get them to recognize and then motivate them to change their behavior. So let's go on to the next slide, but I just want to show you some of the pieces of data that back this up. And this is just a question we asked amongst the national sample about how many of them have had a close call with an accident. And nearly half of them personally have had a close call due to some distraction in their driving. And if you include their circle of friends, 2 out of 3 of them have had some type of close call. And if you'd go on to the next slide, 4 out of 5 of young people believe that they're above average, that they're better drivers, that they're safer drivers than other drivers. They've grown up in this Lake Wobegon area where all of them are above average in terms of their abilities. So they have this heroic assumption that they're good and safe drivers. Another thing that we looked at, if you go on to the next slide here, if you would, this is slide 7, is we looked at it, often it's not what you're saying, but who is the messenger. And one of the things that we always check when we're looking at communications is who is it that they would most likely take advice to when it comes to distracted driving. And right at the top of that list, in terms of on a 1 to scale scale, the most important person to take advice from are those who are the victims of distracted driving or their families. And right close to there is also your spouse, your boyfriend, right at the top as well, and then your parents. And it's notable that your parents, at least the youth's parents, do have a significant role, and they have an ability to affect behavior, get youth to listen to them. I wanted to show that and share that with you as well. And for the most part, for the next part, I want to just take a minute and review this framework that I call values with you. And if you'd go to the next slide, Jamie, on slide 8, just put that up for me. Basically, effective communications, most persuasive communications operate at 4 levels. At one level, they're talking about the physical attributes or features of a product or an issue. Those attributes have certain consequences that are pretty functional in their nature. Those consequences affect us emotionally as a result of what they do to us. And those emotions are evoked because of the values that we have individually. And so when we set about to do this research, we're basically trying to find out what are these connections, what are these 4 levels, and how do they operate in terms of youth and distracted driving. And we start them out with a kind of a blank sheet of paper and saying, of all the different activities which you could engage in or you might engage in, which do you feel is probably the biggest and most risky distraction for you personally while driving? And so they'll mention something. And then we'll say, okay, what would be the consequence if you did that? And how would you feel if that were to happen to you, if that consequence were to happen for you? And when we do this, if you go on to the next slide, slide number 9, begin to see a picture emerge here of what it is that's psychologically underlying distracted driving. And the most distracted behavior is riding while texting or answering a phone call is also an important one. And you see other items that come up. But this texting is important because you go up one level, going from the bottom to the middle now. The potential consequence of that is it could cause an accident. You might be less focused, or it could cause you an accident. And that's the most frequent. And you even have 1 out of 5 say that you could even kill somebody. And that matters because that would make me feel tremendous guilt. It's stupid because I knew better. And those are powerful emotions then at that level. And when you put all these pieces together, if you go on to the next slide, what you have here is that strategic hinge that I introduced to you earlier. And it's very elegant in its simplicity of the structure of how this ties into the values of youth. Texting causes accidents that can injure or take a life. That would create tremendous guilt and shame because I knew better. And that robs me of a sense of peace of mind. So the research that we did for the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety helped us understand what this values architecture and how that would lead to messaging with regard to distracted driving. And we then began to test this. And we tested in first developing some concepts that we could use in communications, and then we also tested it with some videos that were out there. And I'm just going to share with you a couple of these examples of what we learned when we tried to see if, in fact, this is what works. So first of all, if you go to slide 11, Jamie, here we put together several concepts which are a narrative. And some of them are very explicit in terms of the consequences. Others are not as explicit. And what we found is that the concepts that were most explicit were the ones that were most powerful and persuasive in their impact with youth. For example, concept number 4, over half the people identified this out of 7 different constructs as the most powerful. And concept 4 basically says, your world could end at the push of a button. Texting and driving can kill. It's that simple. Don't tempt fate. That text can win. And another one that's also one of the more explicit concepts that we tested was that if you text and drive, a ticket would be the least of your problems. Can you live knowing you took a life? Be smart. Be safe. If not for your sake, then for everyone else. So we saw that those concepts that we developed from the whole range were amongst those that were most effective in communicating and being persuasive with youth about motivating them to change their behavior. And now, Jamie, if you could move ahead to slide 13, skip the next one, go directly to slide 13. Here's where we're looking at 4 different videos that we tested this hypothesis with. One of them I'm sure you're familiar with was a police force in the United Kingdom that produced their own fairly graphic depiction of 4 girls in a car, one of them texting that causes an accident with other cars, and there's a lot of trauma involved. Another one was an AT&T ad, a very short one, 15 seconds. Just showed one word that said, yeah. And then the voiceover came over saying, this is the time for me that my sister before she hit her car and was killed. So there's no visual stimulation, but the copy, the voiceover, is pretty powerful. A third one that was by the U.S. Department of Transportation that showed 4 vignettes of people in different walks of life driving and using their phone or texting, and then ending up with them in an accident. And the fourth one was an Allstate ad. It was selected because it's one of several that we had seen that used humor to talk about the distracted driving to try to create behavior change. And these are 2 men in the car. One of them comes up with an idea that he should notify his insurance company and says, I'm going to go ahead and call my insurance company. And the other tells him, well, you should really think about that while you're driving. And so those were the 4 ads. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what happens when we tested them on important ad metrics, like were they simple and easy to understand? Did they catch my attention? Did it make me want to stop doing anything that might be distracting from my friends while driving? Or did it make me feel that this really does matter a lot for people like me? And you can see, as our hypothesis would have suggested, that the one that was most dramatic, the one that was the Gwent Police Force in the United Kingdom, is getting very high scores. When I test advertising, a score of 7 is a good advertisement. These are in the mid-8, 8.6 on catching my attention. 8.2 makes me want to stop doing anything. So these are very strong ads. The second strongest one was the other one that was second most visually effective, and that was the distraction.gov ad. And then the AT&T ad, and the Allstate ad. As you can see, these are pretty mediocre scores, not very effective. So if you go on to the next slide, I kind of summarize. What we learned is that there is a powerful values-based framework that can be applied to texting and teenage driving. It's built on this principle that young people know and they know better, and that they're therefore going to be most susceptible and responsive to that messaging that really directly confronts them with tragic consequences of not acting on what they know. And that if we were effective in evoking these emotions of guilt, of what they would feel if they were to cause this kind of accident, we're going to be effective in changing their behavior. We also learned that giving voice to the victims or their family is probably the most effective messenger. And then lastly, we learned that in general, to a point at least, the more graphic and dramatic the message and the visuals are, the more effective they are going to be in a changing behavior. So that's when we apply the framework that we've used in other campaigns to distract teenage drivers. I'll go ahead and turn it back. Thank you.
It's a great presentation. Unfortunately, Dee cannot hear us, so won't be able to answer any questions you have later. Our second speaker today is Karen Bowman. She is the founder of a group called Drop It and Drive, a grassroots advocacy organization really focused on ending distracted driving. So I think you'll appreciate her presentation.
Well, good afternoon.
You just pick it up when you're ready again. I'll be ready.
I try and, oh, there we go. Hi. So I'm sure it's been a long day for everyone, but an equally interesting day from my perspective, at least. As you know, I'm going to be talking to you about this education program I've started. I'm going to talk to you about some of the successes we've had and some of the challenges that we face. But before I get into that and delve into what we're trying to do on the front lines with respect to distracted driving, I want to talk to you about why I'm doing this. When I first started this program about 16 months ago, it was with a view to taking a proactive approach to the issue of distracted driving. I have personally been hit in 2 car crashes years ago, but I remember very well the experience. Physical and emotional trauma are caused by someone else's choice at the wheel. The first car crash I was hit in, I was going through a green light and got T-boned. I don't remember much of that crash, but there were long-lasting effects, some of them of which I'm still feeling today. But that actually wasn't the reason why I started this. It gave me a framework, it gave me a perspective to be able to have an idea of what the consequences of distracted driving are. But I started this program because I'm a mom. I'm also a businesswoman. That's another topic. But I'm a mom. I have 2 young children, and I have a husband, I have parents, I have family members and friends who I love and care about. And I saw this issue of distracted driving putting all of them at risk, and so I wanted to do something about it. The ironic thing for me is that we got 3 presentations under our belt as a group. When on January 5th of 2011, this issue became very personal to me when I received a phone call about my 8-year-old daughter. She was being driven home from school by a friend, and when I answered the phone, I assumed that the phone call was confirming they were leaving and they would be home in 20 minutes. Because let's face it, you never assume you're going to get any different phone call than that. And instead what happened when I answered that phone was my friend's daughter screaming hysterically over the phone, "We've been hit." She just kept saying it over and over again. I don't remember to this day if I was standing or sitting when I took that phone call. I do remember not being sure if I was going to throw up or faint. She was so out of her mind with fear that in order to break through that, to get the information that I needed, I had to tell her to shut up and tell me if Kylie is alive. Tell me if she's okay. As a parent, you don't even want to have that question go through your mind, let alone actually come out of your mouth. Long story short, we spent the night in emergency with her being examined by several different emergency room doctors. She spent the next 3 weeks wearing a neck brace 24/7. She had to wear it in the bath. She missed over a week of school. She went from being a carefree, very independent, absolutely fearless 8-year-old to somebody who scared to go upstairs by herself just to brush her teeth before bed. Her dad and I were not with her in the car that day, and that certainly compounded the issue. But all of that could have been avoided if the woman who was driving with her teenage son in the car had been doing her job, which was driving her car. It's all she needed to be doing, was just drive. To this day, I still don't know what she was doing that caused enough distraction that she failed to realize that the vehicle my 8-year-old daughter was sitting in the back of in her booster seat with her shoulder and waist belt as she should be was just starting to pull away from a light that had turned green. And she came down a hill doing highway speeds and crashed full into the back of that car with my kid in it. So, as you can imagine, this is now very personal to me. This is a very important issue. I was not for a second tempted to say, well, I've been doing this for 3 months and look, it happened anyways. I did it to try and stop something from happening, and it still happened. It instead inspired me, and I ground in harder and more determined to do whatever I need to do, to talk to as many people as I need to talk to, and to travel wherever we need to go as a group, to get the message out there that when you are behind that wheel, you have one responsibility, and that is to drive. Everything else is secondary to that. And we're trying to change the perception that driving is secondary to whatever else it is that people are trying to do behind the wheel. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this. Likewise, I'd really like to thank CAA and TURF for bringing me here. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to share what has happened with our education program. Much like the issue of distracted driving, our education program continues to evolve on a daily or weekly basis. We do not have a canned presentation. It changes as new research studies come out. It changes as new stories come out every day. We are constantly updating it so that when we go in and speak to an audience, the information they're seeing is current and it's relevant to them. As you can see, we have partners. The Surrey firefighters, this is the first phone call I made when the idea first came into my head to start up the program, Drop It and Drive. And they came on board immediately that day. Captain Tim Bailey, who's now retired, comes around and he does almost all of these talks with me. 27-year veteran of the firefighters, he has some very personal stories about having to pick up the pieces of people's decisions behind the wheel. The Surrey RCMP came on board very soon thereafter, and likewise, they bring a law enforcement perspective that no one else has. It is completely unique to law enforcement what they go through when they're out on the road. So one of the most common speakers we have is Corporal Brian Federchuk, and he's 17 years in the traffic division. He also does crash scene investigations, so he brings a very unique perspective to these presentations, and he affords an opportunity to answer questions that invariably come up to do with law enforcement and their role in the issue of distracted driving. And then Young Drivers of Canada. They're on the front lines. They're teaching our next generation of drivers how to be safe drivers. Once I started this program, I found out my husband's actually a graduate of Young Drivers of Canada, and he credits them directly for teaching him techniques that he is convinced has saved his life because of what he knew how to do and he was prepared to do. And this is years ago. I'd also just like to briefly recognize our newest gold community sponsor, Klein Lyons. They've come on board to partner with us to help make sure that we've got the resources we need to keep this program going. I should mention, I don't get paid to do this. This is a volunteer basis. We all do this. Everybody who's involved with Drop It and Drive does it because we care about the issue, not because we have funding from any organization or any government agency. We're doing this because it's an important issue that someone needs to be tackling. And then obviously we have some supporters as well, the VIP group, Safety Sense, they're here today, and I just want to thank them so much for getting involved with our organization to support our efforts. Flicking Games and Zoom Safer. You can't do something like this alone. It's not a one-person show. It's the combination of everybody getting involved to help out. So what makes our program work? It's only been in existence for 16 months. It's constantly evolving. But at the end of the day, what we've discovered through feedback from students and faculty and the established drivers that we speak to is our program is flexible, dynamic, and it is reality-based. We also have created something where we can reach multiple ages. One of the ways my daughter dealt with the emotional trauma of her crash was she drew some amazing pictures. She did not get her artistic abilities from me. I can barely draw a stick figure. But she drew these pictures to express how she felt about what happened to her, and that inspired our first annual poster contest that we had last year. And we got over 400 posters, BC-wide, from 15 communities, kids from kindergarten to grade 7, expressing their thoughts on an issue that an age group almost never gets to comment on. So this year, actually, we're right in the middle of our second annual poster contest that's in BC. And then with our presentations to high schools, we're going into these schools and we're trying to talk to teens in a way that is interactive and it's dynamic and it's opening up dialogue with them because we do not believe that they are the problem. We believe that if we can get this message out to teens, they represent the next generation of drivers who will ideally feel the same way about distracted driving that we all know to feel about drinking and driving. If we can get to them before they generate those bad habits, we're hoping we can affect change. And between those two age groups, the messaging is going home to their parents. One of the most common pieces of feedback that we get is, well, what do I do when my mom or dad's driving distracted? What do I say to them? What about my older siblings who don't think I know any better because I'm just a brand new driver? So we try and give them tools on how they can deal with those issues through our YouTube channel and the information that's on our website. Being nationally relevant is important to us. As an organization, we don't align ourselves with any particular legislation across Canada. Everything's just a little bit different. At the end of the day, our message is quite simple. It's reflected in our name. Drop it and drive, whatever it is, whether it's something that's that you're looking for in your hand or something that's going on in your head or it's the phone. Whatever it is that's interfering with your ability to drive safely, you just need to not do it anymore. The speakers that you see up there, when we go in front of a group, we try and encourage them to share with us what they're going through as well, so that we can generate some level of dialogue about this issue. Without communication, you can't affect change. To connect with youth, it's been mentioned a few times already, you have to hit them on an emotional level. If we throw a bunch of statistics at them, they're going to glaze over. The fact that there are 6 Canadians who are going to die on our roads by the end of today in a road crash doesn't reach home. But when you can put it into the perspective that young Casey Feldman, the top left there, she was 21 years old when she was killed at a marked crosswalk because the driver of the vehicle that hit her took the time to put his iced tea in a cup holder. He wasn't speeding, he wasn't texting, he wasn't on a phone, he wasn't on his iPod. He just looked away long enough to put an iced tea in a cup holder. Who of us hasn't done that? The red car and the train, that young 22-year-old was on a handheld phone with her dad. One hand on the steering wheel, one hand on the phone, looking straight out the windshield and drove into the side of a moving train while looking at it. So if you want to ask the difference between hands held, hands-free, it is not about what your hands are doing, it's about what your head's doing. If you can't recognize and process that you're driving into the side of a moving train, what else are you possibly missing? And the other youth there's some recent tragedies in Alberta and Ontario and BC. These young kids, the two on the top right, were killed by trains because they were distracted by their electronic devices. People are not engaged in where they should be in the moment. The two on the bottom left, very recent in BC, at a school that we are supposed to be presenting to in April. Young Dawson in the bottom left would have been in our audience had he not died in a car crash. We would have had a chance to speak with him. It's hard to measure whether or not it would have changed the decisions made that night, but now we'll never know because at the end of the day, he and Crystal are still dead. Okay, so we don't advocate or we don't endorse Allstate, but they're an insurance company who obviously has a vested interest in reducing distracted driving related crashes. This is one of the videos that we'll show on our presentations. It lightens the mood, but it also opens the door to expand the issue of distracted driving into the other issues that go beyond handheld electronic devices. Another avenue that we're using to try and get kids engaged is the Say It Better Distracted Driving Class Challenge. We're opening up the door to these teens who we know are going to listen to each other way more than they're ever going to listen to us, to tell us how they would tell their peers, how they would share this message. I mean, we just have to look at what happened yesterday nationwide with Pink Shirt Day. That was started by teenagers because they cared about the issue. If we can get them to care about this issue and make them, give them an opportunity to have their voice, then they do have the opportunity to be the next generation of drivers who will not think that it's socially acceptable to drive distracted. That was 3 college students a few weeks ago in Nova Scotia. We haven't even branched out into Nova Scotia yet. And they had an opportunity through their course they're taking in college to put together a PSA, and they chose to tackle the issue of distracted driving, put our logo at the end of their PSA, sent it to me, and then subsequently donated it to our program so we can use it. This is just one example of what these kids are capable of doing with the messaging. So the future of our program, obviously we want to continue expanding. We've been invited and we've gone out to speak to high schools in Alberta. We're coming back at the end of this month to speak at a high school and a couple of corporations in Niagara Falls. We've gone to Grand Prairie and we're going into Slave Lake. There's an interesting evolution with our program where we started out in high schools and now we're branching out into corporate presentations. And what that does for us on a couple of levels is it gives us the opportunity to not only reach that added audience of the parents of the kids that we're talking to in schools, but because we as an organization, one of our core values, we will not charge high schools or elementary schools for our presentations. It is not right, in our opinion, to let the budget of a school dictate whether or not they can get this message. The only thing holding us back is when the school is from somewhere in Saskatchewan or Alberta, and we just don't have the funds to travel there, and that's when we start to work with different groups. Whenever we do a corporate presentation, we encourage them, and they are responding so well, to organize a local community event for their community and for their high school. So sure, bring us out to Niagara Falls. We're excited to come and talk to your employees about this issue. We think it's great that you're tackling it as an issue for keeping your employees safe. But here's a chance to reach out into the community as well. So with respect to sustainability, the corporate presentations are providing some fees that can help keep the program going through the high schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all that you do. Our next speaker is Matt Evans. He's an educator and he's an actor. He's also Executive Director of Ontario Students Against Impaired Driving. Matt?
Oh, wrecked it already. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to really thank, and I know it's happened a couple times today, but the organizing team that's put this on. This is phenomenal, especially this Oprah setup here. I love this. And also the crack team here at the back is like the air traffic control or something, you know. Anyway, so congratulations. Excellent. And I will be very brief because I know everybody here wants to get on the road and home, and everybody who isn't from Toronto, they ask, when does the traffic start? It starts in 1984, and it hasn't stopped, okay? Am I okay? Good, okay. Just kidding. I thought of this coming into this presentation. I want to do a little ethno-methodological research. Anybody who's studied sociology in 1968 is going to be all excited about that term. Anyway, I'll give you a little background on myself. I was raised in a small town 3 hours north of here. And as a teenager, what we used to do is come to Toronto to go to concerts, rock concerts. And actually, we used to tell our parents we were coming to see Kenny Rogers. But we would actually get money for the bus and then hitchhike down here and and go see Led Zeppelin. But the reason I did it is, as I say, I'm going back 30, 35 years. I used to come to Toronto. We'd walk around all day long, and then we'd go to the concert, and we'd go home. And then after university, I moved here, and over the years, I've lived in Toronto for about 10 years, okay? And that's got on the transit, walked down Yonge Street, all over the streets, walked around this city lots, okay? So in over, say, 10 years of experience of walking around this city, I've bumped into people 20 times. I mean, walking down the street and went, oh, and you do the pedestrian dance, right? And went around them, maybe 20 times, maybe 25 times. So where I'm going with this is we now have a distracted world. Because in the last 24 hours of being in this city, I've walked into people 6 times. 6 times in 24 hours, and 25 times in 35 years. And all of them were on the cell phone. And here's another thing, too, I'm finding with cell phone is kind of a bystander apathy, right? Where when you walk into someone on the street, it's like, oh, I'm sorry, especially we're all Canadian. Well, not everybody. Canadians, I'm sorry, it's all, it's my fault, let me go around you. Cell phones, you don't get that. You notice that? There's another concept, too. It's like, boom, they look at you like, You know, they're in another world completely. And I think we all understand that, especially the researchers. So I just thought it was interesting to note that we live in a distracted world. And anybody knows with email, 10 years ago I would say I'm an incredibly good time manager. With the onset of email, not anymore. Anyway, I'll give you a little history. I run an organization, or it runs me, I should say, called Ontario Students Against Impaired Driving. Started in 1986. It was called SAD Ontario. Changed their name in 87 to include impaired driving. It's called Ontario Students Against Impaired Driving. It started as a collection of teachers, high school students, sick of seeing impaired drivers and students in their school dying, right? Like a lot of these organizations started at the time. By 1987 to 1995, the largest decline in the rate of impaired driving in the province of Ontario was amongst the teen population, a rate reduction of 53%. I think, maybe because I was involved in the issue, it wasn't just a cloud descended and the teens decided not to drink and drive. It's because the main delivery vehicle of the messaging was teenagers. It was peer education. So this organization now, over the years, is between 300 and 500 chapters. Now we're at about 300. It's kind of leveled out. We have 2 staff, 5,000 volunteers, 15 elected teenagers who sit with our board of directors, 26th annual conference coming up, 3 days long leadership conference, 5 regional one-day workshops a year, 2 poster projects and annual projects. We do this, you ready? You sitting down? Yeah. We do this on taking the conference out of our annual budget. We do this on $220 a day. How do we do that? I'm extremely tired. It's a lot of volunteers and a lot of management of volunteers. What are our strengths? So I thought, well, what do you folks want to know? There's people here with policy. There's people here who are researchers. Well, a lot of you are probably going to be working with youth, or the end delivery of your product to talk about distracted driving is going to be youth. In my situation, I think there's a big difference between youth and teens. Okay, I deal with teens, and I'll come to that in a second. So that's why I think they brought me in primarily. Is here's some things I've learned, okay, over the years that I think a lot of people, and I know parents have teenagers, some of you, and there's a big difference I've found between having teenagers and working with teenagers. And parents sometimes are the last people to see what's happening with their kids, right? So the strengths in our organization, one, it's a peer education program. Very important. Don't get caught up. There's a lot of programs that call themselves youth programs that I would consider bogus, okay? Why are they a youth program? A youth program is where they involve teenagers in the creation, of what they're going to do, and they're also involved in the dissemination of it, okay? No, not just, okay, let's do some research and test studies with teenagers and then let's implement it. It's have the teenagers help implement it, because I think that's key with what's happened with OSIT over the years and why the impaired driving, amongst our many partners and graduated licensing, but why the teenagers and why it's top of mind now. How many members are in that organization? Do they say they're a youth program and really they have 2 youth members and that's it? Can they really get that message out there? And also, age is very, very important. I find as people become adults, and I mean over the age of 21, they magically forget what it's like to be a teenager, okay? And so we have a mandate to talk about youth, right? And so we'll say, oh, well, let's just throw everything at the 15 to 24-year-olds. Big difference there. Big difference there. And when you think about it, look at your 5 years you spent in high school, okay? Many of you probably in the last 10 years or 20 years have had to go to high school reunions, right? And you think about it now with Facebook, all of a sudden the high school reunions are all over the place, and you think, wow, and you think you have this connection with this guy or this girl, and you realize, wow, you know what? I probably really only knew them for 2 years, and I only saw them in the halls, but you have this magical connection with them. That's what's happening in a teen's mind, and I find adults forget about that, right? We forget. I say teenagers have dog years. An adult is 1 year, is our life horizon. Teenagers, 7 years, What's happening next weekend is 7 years from now. So very important to realize that. And so I've found many times where people have some great ideas in implementation, and then for teenage population, then they'll say, well, let's involve the college and university students. It just doesn't work. It's a different world, very different world. Also, we have a perception, because we're all locked in at a certain age. I think I'm 19, where I'm really 110. But we all have this age that we're locked into, right? Very important. I did an event. It was a cross promotion with Nissan and OSED, and we did a big community car wash. Okay, so there's a lot of teenage girls helping with the car wash, which brought in a lot of creeps. Okay, so this. And I always use this as an example because this is classic, okay? For those of you who think you're hip and groovy, right? Did I say groovy? Yeah, I said that loud on the webinar, okay. That's live, right? I am a union actor, so there will be an invoice. Just kidding. Okay. So we did this event, and the girl came up because some creep came around and said some things, and I went, what happened, right? And she said this. Here's the statement, okay? This is gross because this guy, I mean, she said it 5 times. He's really, 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 really old, like 40. Okay? Remember that. Really, 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 really old. Okay. Oh, yeah. So anyway, I had a provincial meeting, all our teens from across the province. This is you may think it's not a random sample, but it's not. But it's how we've done business for 25 years. We have these students who sit on our board of directors. They come from the country, they come from the city. Some are rich, some are poor, some are from different backgrounds ethnically. They're from all over. And we bounce the ideas off them. And they might not be the heavy risk. Occasionally we get the risk student in there. But they're going to tell you what's going to fly at their school. That's why our program works, right? What's going to fly in Timmins is not going to fly in Toronto. And the students at the school will take the idea and they'll say, they know what's going to work at their school. So I asked our gang, I said, look, I got to go to, not gang. Playback. I asked our guys, I'm terrified of what, normally, I come out here and offend somebody for sure. But now it's not going to be on space. Okay. So, I asked them, I'm going to a distracted driving conference, and they kind of want your teen perspective. So here's some of the ideas they just sort of threw at me, okay? First of all, the main thing was you can't just piggyback the issue of impaired driving. Hey, impaired driving, we did a good job there. We've been doing it for 25 years. Just add distracted driving, and it's going to happen. It's going to take 10, 15 years, I think, at least. Look, it used to be legal 5 years ago here in this province, and now it's not. Impaired driving has taken a long time, and we get that in the adult population too, right? We'll get that in the adult. We'll go, oh, well, impaired driving, that's a done deal. Teenagers don't hear the message till they're teenagers, okay? We think it's all fixed. That's why I have a hard time selling impaired driving to the corporate sector to try and support projects, because they think it's fixed. It's not with teenagers. It's always a new issue. They may have heard the ideas, but until they're actually getting into the car, then it's relevant, right? So that was important. Couldn't just piggyback. Our guys anyway, they still like the term impaired. We thought, we should lighten it up a bit. It's a little scary. Students against impaired driving. They want it. That's what's sexy to them. Impaired driving against impaired. They don't want, distracted. They want to feather those issues in. They want to talk about them, but they want the heavy, aggressive term. Our guys did anyway. They thought hands-on stuff might be helpful because they think they can do it. And we know the cost with that, but like the simulators, they thought that might be, if we could somehow incorporate that into driver ed courses, into young driver courses, somehow where they actually see that they can't do it. And we partnered, with Ministry of Transportation and Arrive Live to do distracted driving, 7 years ago on the iDrive video, where we talk about those issues, and you can actually see them. People going in and thinking they can do stuff, and then realizing, and there's kind of a light bulb does go off. Greed, this was a good one. What am I going to get for not texting and driving? Can we get a coupon? They said that. Can we get a coupon? They said, well, when the guys, they pull someone over and he's not impaired and they say, thank you very much, and they used to get a coupon. Remember Ride used to give out turkeys. You have a turkey for Christmas. Anyway, they thought some kind of coupon, but that concept's there. Maybe not a coupon, but something showing, that we're rewarding you for doing that, right? Very important, and I've found with this issue many, many times, is that, and we see it a lot, death doesn't scare teenagers, right? Insurance rates do. And a lot of you as parents are paying for your teen's insurance, in Ontario anyway, and I find that the teenagers, you really have to tell them, like you say, you know what, you busted for impaired driving or whatever drive, your parents' insurance is going up to $10,000, right? Oh, kind of like that's what scares them. Or you're trying to get into university, you're going to have a charge. You're going to be charged with something. These are things. Death doesn't scare them. Yes, the scary stuff does resonate, like we saw, but for how long, right? Unless there's that follow-up, unless there's the grassroots where there's a constant education, I find you need to use different approaches. The scary stuff works to get the message there. Sometimes a direct approach, sometimes certainly the peer education approach, where they're selling the message to their teens. And an example of that is crystal meth. They were trying to deal with the crystal meth issue, and it's what's going to work. And I think, sorry, I just don't have the research, but it was Utah or Washington State. It was the Dental Association, right? For years, how am I going to get the girls off crystal meth? Because they're telling them they're going to die from it, or it's going to mess up their grades, whatever. It was irrelevant. Until they said, you know what, 2 years of crystal meth use, look what's going to happen to your teeth. Decline in crystal meth. So it's what works, right? Last thing, this is what completely, and I'll leave you with this one. This completely amazed me. Because I said, as an adult, we see you guys driving down the road, your passenger is not texting, and you're driving and texting. We as adults cannot understand why you can't give your phone to your friend, your girlfriend, boyfriend, and have them do the texting. This is what they said. It's a diary. It's like asking a 14-year-old girl, can I read your diary? Ain't going to happen. They said, you can't believe how many times where a friend grabs my phone at a party, and all of a sudden they're texting and they're getting my contacts and all sorts of stuff. That's their personal thing. That's why they don't hand it. Safety is irrelevant because they're not going to hand over their personal diary, even to their friend, right? So to me, that was a real eye-opener because that was the answer, right? Just have your friend do the texting rather than you. Anyway, I'll leave you with that. Just remember the really, 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 really old. But that's important to know that it doesn't matter. And I found this working with teenagers, okay? It doesn't matter how old you are. And everybody from 30 years and under is going to hate me for this. But just because you're closer to their age doesn't mean you can relate. It's a different ballgame. You may remember, but sometimes they might get their back up, and it's all about giving them respect and giving them the room to play and get their message across to their friends. And we're going to guide them. But, hey, it's worked for us, and we've been around for 25 years working on virtually no money. So thank you very much.
Matt, thank you. Our last speaker in this panel is Jill McIntosh. She's a freelance writer and has written for almost 30 years on automobiles and automotive issues for a variety of publications in the media. And she's our last speaker. Her personal website, by the way, is womanonwheels.ca, so she's very much vested in what she does. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm pretty boring. I just stand in one space and read this, which is how I spend most of my working day. As I would like to thank the CAA and TURF for asking me to come here. As mentioned, I do work in media, primarily for the Toronto Star, for Simpatico Autos, autos.ca. I was a taxi driver, so I know a little bit about how to be an unsafe driver. I review cars primarily, but I also write about safety, and the two are naturally entwined. They're becoming more so with every new connectivity device that the automakers install. I recently interviewed the president of a luxury car company. He told me that the company's focus groups found that some young people view driving as the distraction. They're demanding to be online 24/7, and they don't want their lives interrupted just because they're piloting a car. I spoke to the vice president of a Japanese car company. He told me that he no longer just has to worry about getting people out of other vehicles and into his own. He now has to figure out how to woo people who are more interested in smartphones and tablets, and they're not interested in cars. And last year, I attended the launch of a brand new sporty model from a manufacturer that is generally all about the driving experience. And during the product presentation, they spent more time talking about the connectivity features than they did talking about the engine. I'm going to go on a little, I have nothing to back this up, but I often wonder if the huge sums of money that automakers have put into Bluetooth play a part in this, and if maybe there's lobbying, and maybe this involves how these decisions are made. The question is, how can media make a difference? And it's a difficult question because in the auto media, we're hemmed in on all sides. On one hand, we have readers who may not believe that cell phones are a problem. On the other hand, we're writing about vehicles that have sophisticated technology, including systems that will now read your text messages, it will tune into Facebook while you're driving. We can't just leave that information out of the story because we personally believe that it's unsafe or it's unnecessary. Speaking generally, I can divide readers into three camps. The first one isn't all that connected. They tend to be older, and they don't think that phone calls in a car are necessary. I'm preaching to this choir. The second is connected, but not overly so, is generally slightly younger, and usually argues that the phone is no more distracting than talking to passengers or listening to the radio, which is something that was brought up many times today. Sometimes, although not often, it's possible for me to make headway with these readers if I can cite studies that say otherwise. The third camp, completely connected, younger, thinks I'm an old fart who's saying, "You kids get off my lawn." They're also the most likely to be reading, if they are reading, on a handheld device. And it's extremely unlikely that I'm going to change their minds with any kind of information. I'm not sure if they don't believe the statistics or if they simply believe that nothing bad is going to happen to them, but I don't think that any newspaper or online story is going to affect their behavior. So at the moment, I'm concentrating on reaching that second group, the one that I may be able to persuade, and trying to figure out what we in the media can do to reach that third one. The biggest challenge, and it's one that we have heard many times today, is convincing people that this could happen to you. For several years, I've used my newspaper columns and online columns to try and educate people about the potential danger of airbags. One issue I regularly target is front seat drivers, most of them whom are children or teenagers, who ride with their feet up on the dash. If the airbag goes off, and it doesn't take much of an impact to do that, that bag is going to deploy at 300 kilometers an hour. The surgeon will likely take that passenger's thighs out of what's left of the pelvis, and then give the news that he or she will probably not walk properly again. The problem here is twofold. First, the public generally only sees airbags either in slow motion, because you can't see them with the naked eye, or they see them played to comic effect in television or the movies, where they are gently inflated pillows, and so they don't realize that these are rock-hard projectiles that can kill you. Secondly, out of all the passengers who ride with their legs on the dash, how many of them are actually doing it at the exact moment that a crash occurs and the airbags inflate? The result is that people underestimate the damage, the danger, and they disregard the risk. They don't know enough people who have had such a horrific thing happen to them. Likewise, the majority of people take phone calls, handheld or hands-free, on a daily basis when they're behind the wheel. Nothing has happened to them. They haven't hit anyone, they haven't been hit, and they probably don't know anyone who's had a collision on the phone when texting, or at least they don't know anyone who will admit it. If they do know someone who has, they may believe it was simply because that driver wasn't as good at multitasking as they are. As we've heard here again today, most drivers believe they're better overall, and I also expect most believe they're better than average at driving while they're on the phone. These people aren't going to change their habits because I say they should. Another problem, I believe, is that the penalty for texting or talking is not severe enough. People do cost-benefit analysis. I know people who speed excessively on the highway, but they keep an eye on that speedometer that they will not go over 150 kilometers an hour, because here in Ontario, if you're caught doing that, you lose your car. I have friends who will have a few drinks and believe that they can safely drive home, but they won't. They'll call a designated driver service or they'll give their keys over because they will lose their license. But when it comes to talking to the phone here in Ontario, there's a $155 fine if they get caught, no demerit points. That's not a deterrent. Graphically illustrating what happens in a serious crash may be the way to get the message across, as we saw in one of the presentations. I've seen some of the advertisements from Australia's Transport Accident Commission, which recreates serious crashes for the camera. The clips show, through the magic of the movies, I hope, what it looks like when someone actually gets hit by a car, goes headfirst into a windshield, or slams into a pole. There's still some questions, of course, about how much of a part they played in the country's traffic fatality reduction, but there's no question that they have a gut reaction when you watch them. Many years ago, I wrote a story on traffic fatalities, and the officers who investigated them showed me several photos from crash scenes. I'm thinking it was gallows-type humor. They wanted to see if they could get the reporter to throw up. What they didn't know was that I used to work in a surgical supply company, and at lunch I would read the illustrated medical journals for something to do. So they didn't really have a chance. But all kidding aside, after I saw bodies wrapped around steering wheels, and I saw the top of someone's brain because the windshield had taken off the top of his skull, I never drove more carefully than I did on the way home. I've always said that instead of showing pictures of crashed cars, we should show pictures of crashed people. And maybe that will get the point across. But the problem we face in the media is overloading the reader. There's a fine line between making a point and nagging, and we have to be careful that we don't overdo it to the point that people tune us out. There's also the problem of numbers. People lose sight when you start giving them big numbers. As an example, if you want to raise money for a charity at Christmas, you don't say that we're going to give gifts to 10,000 children across the city. What you say is, here's one little boy, and here he is with his brand new train set. And you will not be able to stop people from giving charitable donations. They understand one-on-one. So I think that the example given earlier of highlighting a family that has had this happen to them is a very effective one, and this is something that in the media we're going to have to look at. The shift of social acceptance of drunk driving happened gradually, and to be honest, it happened so gradually that I don't even remember how it came about. I don't remember the progressive steps. But it did. When I was a child, I'm going to say it was just not that long ago, there was an immensely popular comedian named Foster Brooks. And his entire act consisted of acting like he was drunk, especially behind the wheel. Imagine trying to be a comedian today and making a living off that. You'd probably get booed off the stage. We'll never completely eradicate drunk driving, but we've made remarkable headway through public education, and we need now to apply those steps to distracted driving. When I go into a liquor store, there are reminders to drink responsibly. There are red ribbons at the counter, and depending on the season, there may be posters telling me about sober driving. When I go into a casino, there's a gambling hotline on every slot machine, and in some there are video terminals that educate me about gambling addiction. There's none that tell me how to win, unfortunately. So what about phone stores? The only thing I've ever seen is one hand-lettered sign in a store in my local mall that promoted headset sales with the phrase, "Drive safely." Why aren't there posters in phone stores about the dangers of texting while driving? Why aren't there public service safety advertising at the place where people actually buy their phones? Why don't we have Lady Gaga and Justin Bieber doing public service announcements about the dangers, including targeting teenagers who are too young to drive, but sufficiently connected that they walk into traffic while they're texting? And these will be the drivers of the future. Could we have been further ahead today if years ago Steve Jobs had appeared in ads and said, "Please buy our new smartphone, but put the damn thing down while you're driving"? Media can be a powerful thing, but it all depends on knowing how and when to use it. Now, what you can do, those of you in research, in law enforcement, in public awareness, what can you do to help us in the media? We want to work with you. We're hungry for stories. Give us something to write about. Send us press releases. If you're not familiar with how to write a press release, there are PR firms that specialize in it. If it's timely, such as a police blitz, which the OPP do, send us the information at least a week in advance if you can, because we have lead-in times and we have to coordinate. If you're referencing a very scientific study, give us a synopsis. We may not be familiar with your area of expertise. We could possibly misinterpret data as we try to squeeze a 30-page report into 600 words. But send us studies. The most common response I get from readers whenever I write about distracted driving is, "Well, there are lots of distractions and I don't see why you're singling this one out." Give me proof, give me data, give me ammunition. Include your releases on wire services that are free for journalists to use. These include Canada Newswire, Business Wire, MarketWire, and PR Newswire. Many of us are freelancers, and we don't always have easy access to the subscription services that the newspapers and the television stations buy and use. Many Canadian car writers are members of the Automobile Journalists Association of Canada, or AJAC. I'm a member. You can reach us through our association at ajac.ca. That's AJAC.ca. It's an important site for you now because AJAC has recently had several younger members join, and many of them are active in social media. These are young journalists who are reaching young readers, and those are the very readers who don't always listen when older readers try and tell them what's what. I can't guarantee that we in the media will use absolutely everything you send us, but we need to know what you're doing. We're the middlemen between the work that you're doing and the people you need to reach. We want to work with you. Always remember to keep us in the loop, and we'll return the favor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. I know it's very late at the end of the day. We do have time for one or two quick questions if we have any of our panelists. Okay, and Dee is available to answer questions remotely if you have a question of him. Anything? Okay, I'm going to thank our panel one more time. And I believe I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and to Robin for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Okay, who's still with me? Yes? Yay! Okay, good. Okay. I'm going to make an effort to summarize some of the key thoughts that we've shared today, and we've covered quite a range of ideas, so bear with me. Our first one is research complexities. It's been difficult to do research on the issue because of the complexities associated with the behavior and the diverse conditions under which it occurs. So every study has value, but every study also has limitations, and it's important to recognize that. Measurement challenges, because of the nature of the activity, measuring it accurately and consistently is something that we have to continue to work on. We can measure things like cell phone use, measuring things like daydreaming and not thinking about other things instead of driving will take more challenge. There's not a good understanding of risk was another key message that came out. And understanding the messaging, doing good messaging around the risks are important. I think a very salient point that was made on a number of occasions was the fact that these behaviors are not comparable. They are distinct and unique, and we need to treat them as such, particularly when we're messaging around risk. Laws and enforcement have had a positive effect. We are still looking to see greater results, but we have had some good results with this. And it's good that from the experiences we've had, we've recognized that there are some practical limitations in terms of what can be done. Number 5, there's lots of attention on distraction across a whole range of disciplines, and I think this is really an important step forward in terms of addressing the issue. We need to engage all the different segments and communities that are relevant to this issue to keep moving it forward. Challenging the us versus them mentality. This came out a few times. And now I know from Dee actually that people learn that they're an above average driver when they're a teenager, and they hold on to that belief throughout their driving career. And I think the challenge is we tend to think of us versus them. I'm a good driver, it's the other person on the road who's not. And I think we need to have a shift in philosophy, and it's not I'm a good driver or I'm a bad driver, but it's I drive well under some conditions and I drive poorly under other conditions, and it's getting people to make those linkages under what conditions they do drive poorly before they're going to listen to the message. We've seen some very good precedents that we can look to for examples. We've seen on a company perspective that total bans on all phone use, there will be acceptance for that, and there can be penalties that are imposed. We've learned that the context of jurisdictions and of the audience who we're trying to get our message across to is very important in developing programs and policies. This will not be a cut and paste approach, but we need to think carefully about who we're targeting and what's relevant for them. And of course, who delivers the message is also important. Learning through values campaign, what's working to motivate changes in behavior. I think there's some good examples there that we can look to. And some essential features of program, particularly when it comes to working with youth. We have an opportunity to initiate a culture change with youth, and we can draw upon what has worked with impaired driving. Having youth involved in implementation, and more importantly, having sustained efforts and making sure that we're seeing sustained effects in terms of reducing distractions over the longer period will be important for us moving forward. And taking all of this information and translating it for the media, making sure that what we're doing in our own communities is being made available so we can get that message out to a broader audience. So that's a summary of the day. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to conclude.
We're going to work with TURF. We're going to work together to try to pull together something that we can all work with, a document or something like that. Maybe work on some op-eds or something like that flow from the conference. So some of the stuff Robin and I have been talking about doing as we've been here today. I guess a couple things I just want to close with. Number one is that this is a forum that we've done something a little bit unique, which is basically pulled together a multidisciplinary community of people together and have dialogue. And I personally, as being somebody sort of from one of those disciplines, really, really love being able to listen to and understand how this world works and how different other groups of people, other disciplines come at it. So I think it's been a valuable exercise, certainly for me, to hear from different groups of people. I mean, I can't, I'm immediately taking away some of the stuff that Dr. Strayer talked about cognitive distraction and how it layers, how different levels of distraction layer on top of each other, thus creating those problems where you see the EKG, these other kind of problems. That's a narrative that can work in the public domain, I believe. And so I see as a public, education person, how we manifest that and turn that into something real. So to me, that's a real value for sure. Leaving that aside, I want to thank everyone very much for coming here today. I want to thank a lot of people, Elaine and Ian from my team, Sarah from Robin's team. You guys in AV, awesome, especially dealing with Dee. The Dee thing actually just happened this afternoon, and these guys, the AV guys, figured out a plan to have Dee come in on Skype, which is fantastic. So we really appreciate that. Thank you, those who are watching on the webcast. Thanks for sticking with us. And as I remind you all, you'll be able to grab onto this webcast. Just go to our distracteddriving.ca site and send a link to friends or whatever, and if they want to have a look at the content. So I think that's pretty much it. We just want to thank everybody for coming out today, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon.